Professor Chris Thurman is a professor of English literature at Wits University. He joins us now. Why are we speaking to a professor of English literature, I hear you ask? That's because the language of this election is fascinating. Prof, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon to you.
I am struck by the coarseness of the language we've seen in the US elections, the sort of personal insults that the various sides, and particularly, I mean, we have to say this, particularly Trump, throw at each other.
Yes, well, I suppose what we've learned is that the Michelle Obama strategy, when they go low, we go high, admirable as it is, has not necessarily served the Democrats particularly well under the Trump administration. And it's very difficult, I think, to play by the rules and win by the rules as one side if it's fairly clear that the other side is not willing to. And that applies both to gerrymandering and to, I think it is probably fair to say, to some electoral intervention. One doesn't want to use words like fraud because, like fake news, it's a term that Donald Trump has corrupted. But I do think that the language in which or the rhetoric of presidential politics in the US and the political spectrum more generally over the last 4 years has been conducted suggests that there isn't really any capacity to find the kind of middle ground that so many people are calling for. Bipartisanship is impossible when effectively we have two sets of language, two different kinds of rhetoric of language, two different sets of vocabulary, and two different sides that have recourse to very fixed terms and vocabulary that makes it almost impossible to find a kind of conceptual meeting ground.
I'm old enough to get to the stage in life where I'd like to think that politicians that came before now were better and were somehow more, I suppose, gentlemanly. Politer is a much better word. I don't know if that was necessarily the case, but certainly if you look at, US presidential debates going all the way back to the first one between Nixon and Kennedy and the ones that came later, people certainly seemed more polite to each other than they were now. Is that just, my old memory, or do you think that's actually true?
I think it might be age, I have to say. I mean, my sense is that the veneer of respectability has always been there and has given a certain kind of, by implication or projection, a certain respectability to what has often been a lot of cloak and dagger politics in the US over 70 years since the end of the Second World War. And particularly since the 1970s and 80s and the kind of, I suppose we could call it the culture wars and the extreme split between Democrats and Republicans that has developed out of that. I do think it's probably accurate to observe that respectability is expected of certain speaking figures. And so when women, in particular black women, are speaking out of anger or frustration, out of a sense of injustice, they are told that they should speak more appropriately. And when white men in power are allowed to speak with insult or with name-calling or with outright lies, they are not held to account in the same way. So I think there's an interesting demographics to the language of respectability and what is expected of public figures.
There was this amazing moment in vice presidential debate, I don't know if you saw it, when Kamala Harris was speaking and being interrupted by Mike Pence, the vice president, and she just said, Vice President, I'm speaking. I mean, I thought that what's been happening in the United States over the last 20 years was at play in just that moment.
Absolutely, yes. And there are iconic images of Democrat senators, black women in particular, having to stand their ground, in Congress and in the House of Representatives, saying, I'm claiming my time, I'm claiming my space, my opportunity to speak. So I do think that it sounds trite to sort of summarize American politics in terms of microphones and money over the last few years, but I think that's certainly been the case. And it's not just a question of who has access to a public voice, because we know that social media plays a huge role, and ostensibly there's a kind of free access to social media. So it's not just a question of being able to put your voice into the public sphere. I think it's what you're allowed to say, the expectations of the so-called voting public, of what candidates are allowed to say. And the celebration of Joe Biden saying, shut up, man, when he couldn't think of anything better to say to Trump in the first debate is probably an indication of that.
Dr. Otto Grobela, I mean, you're a political analyst at the University of the Free State. Have you been struck by this, the coarseness of the language used by, everybody? But I suppose in a way you could argue that the tone is set by the incumbent, by the president.
Absolutely. I think, from a personal perspective as well, the way in which he refers to women, for example, I don't think we are surprised anymore. by anything that he says. And I also think that the veil was kind of lifted by social media, where it's safe to say whatever you like and it's safe to call anyone anything, because you can hide behind this mask of a profile picture or of anything. And that kind of just relayed and started to apply to society as a whole, where you can label it as freedom of speech, and you can carry on and say what you like and just say, hey, I'm free to do so.
I suppose the thing about Twitter is that, unlike, someone who comes into a studio and faces, gets interviewed or goes to a press conference and is interviewed, they're interrogated. So if you say X, Y, Z, you have to say, well, what do you base that on? On Twitter, you can pick and choose who you answer. You can just ignore people you don't like. What you're suggesting is that sort of dynamic of Twitter has become something that's infected all of our public discourse.
Absolutely, and it makes it so easy, and you can choose who you want to be, and if you don't have a response for someone, you can take your time, you can jump up on a search engine and choose a wise response and sound very informed, even though you maybe are not. So I think it just gets easier every day.
It's interesting. Professor Thurman, again, if we go back through American history, there's a famous phrase from a debate where one of the people sort of referred to Bob Kennedy and to Jack Kennedy, rather, and the person who was debating against said, well, I knew Jack Kennedy and you're not Jack Kennedy. That was quite rude for its time.
Yeah.
Again, back to the sort of rose-tinted spectacles question. Are we sort of thinking that the past was nicer than it was?
Well, it partly depends on who has access to vote. In other words, who is going to translate persuasive politics into action at the ballot box. And there I think, we see a lot of exit polls or exit analysis giving us kind of demographic breakdowns, many of which we could predict along gender lines, along race lines. I suppose two that surprise us are around what clumsily people call class, which I suppose is really about income. And the curious ways in which I would say exit polls thus far indicate that a lot of Trump voters are voting against their own best interests as working class Americans who are at risk of slipping under the poverty line or below the poverty line. There's a book that has the title Dying of Whiteness, and I think one could argue that the kind of crass appeals of Trump to that sort of nativist, racist, sexist, kind of deep-seated fear, which translates into bigotry. His language, appeals to that and can persuade people to vote against their best interest. But there are two other considerations, and those really hinge around education. And I think the problem in the US is that the way that populism is manifested there, as it does in so many countries around the world, is in the claim that there is an educated elite who have access to better jobs, which feeds into the kind of QAnon conspiracies about, the elitists and how they are, often with anti-Semitic associations, often with, the more bizarre ends of the theory around pedophilic rings and Pizzagate and that sort of thing, we wouldn't think could be believed. But the more subtly coded language, I think, is a kind of gateway drug through which many people slip. And so really what we're looking at is not just a question of a mediascape where you can create or have created for you in social media or in your choice of TV channel a kind of echo chamber that simply reinforces and confirms your views, but also the inability of a large portion of the voting public to critically discern the media that they're consuming. And that does hinge very strongly around education. So it's not just a question of a so-called educated public being more likely to vote for the Democrats and for Biden. It's also that people don't know, because of a lack of particularly college-level education, that they're being duped. Having said all of that, the final thing that I think is crucial, and which we need to reinsert into the conversation again and again and again, is that it seems very clear by now, although we're waiting for electoral college votes to be clarified, Biden will win the popular vote by probably over 2 or 3 million votes, or a margin of 2 or 3 million votes. And so much as we might talk about the way that American elections go and how that might link to the language of the candidates, the policies of the candidates, the education of the voting base, the demographics of the voting base, all of that is really absurd if we're not taking into account the skewing of the electoral college, which makes a mockery of the popular vote.
Also, Dr. Ultra Grobela on the line with us from the University of the Free State. Just a last one to you before we release you. Are you going to join the very, very crowded room of people who refuse to make predictions at this point?
I think there's still a space left for me, yes. I think it's too close to call. And as I told a friend of mine earlier, we were talking about Trump, and I just told him, "Aish, that guy." So I don't know. I will just hold my breath and have a look at what happens.
There are many different issues coming out of the US election. Now, we're expecting an important press conference in Pennsylvania, one of the key sites of vote counting this afternoon. Well, this afternoon our time, this morning their time. I'll tell you why. It's one of those states that really could swing the US presidential election. We know that they've been counting furiously. We know that the counting in this election might also take slightly longer than in other elections, because before Election Day, 100 million Americans had voted by postal vote. And what that means is that instead of a box of votes where you can literally unfold the piece of paper, look at the vote and put it in the correct place, in this case, often with a postal vote and a postal ballot, and it can be different from state to state, you actually have to take the piece of paper out of an envelope, check the date that it was sent, the postmark as they call it in the US, and go from there. So we don't yet know when the result will come. We do know that the US President Donald Trump, unsurprisingly, if I may say, has declared victory. Joe Biden, the presidential contender, the former vice president, has told his supporters to keep the faith. Professor Chris Thurman is a professor of English literature at Wits University, discussing language, politics, and I'm going to take him to the question around language and thought. Professor, we've been talking about the insults and the way that people have described their opponents in this campaign, and again, the tone sort of led by the incumbent, by President Trump. We also know there's this sort of presumably an academic theory about how language determines thought. So if this is these are the words that people are using to describe each other in public, what does that mean for their thoughts?
Absolutely. I mean, we could, if when we had hours at our disposal, we could, push the sort of profundities of whether or not, words precede action, or whether they precede concepts, or if those things can exist or occur without language guiding them or defining them. But what we can certainly say is that the language particularly the language of President Trump, enables certain action. And so, the tricky thing is that it's very easy as an analyst to be interested in the difference between Trump saying, stand down, Proud Boys, or stand back, Proud Boys, or stand by, Proud Boys, because those could be three different sets of advice or warning to a right-wing, white nationalist American militia group. The difficulty is that we know that has real-world consequences. And so I think there is the difficulty for us as analysts, but also for anyone who's observing the American election. There's a kind of intellectual interest in the way in which words are used or misused. And then there's also the kind of brunt end of that, the ugly end, the consequences of Trump saying there are fine people on both sides. And there it's difficult to know how much is strategy and how much is that strange consequence of whatever happens in Donald's brain. Because, and I'm giving away my biases here, but I'm sort of not apologetic about that. On the one hand, we know that there would be very careful Republican Party strategy and Trump strategists from 2011, 2012, when he was first thinking about running, that might have resulted in lock her up for Hillary Clinton, or clever phrases like crooked Hillary, which just kind of capture the public imagination, or at least a public that is ready to be pushed into a particular set of beliefs or taken to be encouraged to take certain actions. If you can galvanize that around a particular phrase, that's really useful. There are other times when Trump seems to be lost in a sea of language and sort of grabbing at straws, clasping at any monosyllabic word that'll do the job for him. And so it's very difficult to know how much of that is very carefully calculated strategy and how much of it is just sort of sheer dumb luck. Or bad luck, I guess we could say, for American electoral politics.
Boris Johnson's the same, isn't he? I mean, he comes out with amazing sound bites, but also gives this sort of phrase, I mean, I'll use the word doofus. I mean, he comes across a bit like he's searching for words and a bit muddled.
Yes.
I'm not convinced it's luck at all. I'm afraid to say I think there's a lot of calculation here.
Yeah, I mean, in Johnson's case, there's that sort of strange appeal to the way that upper-class Etonian toffs should sound. If you have a certain aspiration in your voice, you must be making sense and you must be educated. And I think the sort of the stereotype of the bumbling aristocrat, or the kind of moneyed gentleman who's prone towards gaffes, has been made fairly innocuous, whether it's through Prince Philip or through decades and generations of the upper English classes, and so Johnson has recourse to that You know, when he says something that is silly, when he's trying to appeal to a kind of really set of nativist claims around Brexit or around the way in which the coronavirus has been treated or bungled in the UK, you know, he thinks it's Churchill, but really it comes out as a muddle. And there's partly a calculated performance in that, but I think it's also, as much as it might be, as you point out, strategic on the part of these individual speakers, there is a pre-existing set of expectations. And so some of your panelists this afternoon have spoken about, you know, what people are ready to hear. And how you can tap into that very easily. And so we have, you know, the big man. I mean, there's no question that's what Trump is playing to, a kind of crisis of masculinity in the US. A sense, I think, particularly amongst white men, who we know are the primary Trump voting demographic, that they are really ready to be superseded, that it's time for them to, you know, take a more modest place in American society or global society, and who are desperate to cling to a kind of minority but majoritarian or at least empowered position. And so you have here a man who, through the violence of his rhetoric, through the crassness of his language, and through the success that he demonstrates despite that, and despite, in fact, a track record of failings as a businessman or otherwise, he gives you an opportunity to say, well, if he's still hanging around there and saying these things, he's empowering me, and I can either choose the kind of bold Trumpian track of emphasizing my own bigotry and as a kind of, you know, up yours in the face of those whose interests are not protected by Republican politics, or you can do it quietly, which it seems a few, perhaps dozens of, but at least a few million Americans have done, which is to say, I won't tell people I'm voting for Trump, but I'll sure go ahead and do it because ultimately I know he protects my narrow interests.
Professor Chris Thurman with us. Let's hear from the man himself. I'm not talking about Chris Thurman, I'm talking about President Donald Trump. He claimed earlier that he had already won the election. That's despite the fact that millions of votes still haven't been counted. He also announced that he'll approach the US Supreme Court over vote counting, which is still going on late into the night in some states.
And all of a sudden, everything just stopped. This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election. So our goal now is to ensure the integrity for the good of this nation. This is a very big moment. This is a major fraud in our nation. We want the law to be used in a proper manner. So we'll be going to the U.S. Supreme Court. We want all voting to stop. We don't want them to find any ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning and add them to the list. Okay? It's a very sad moment. To me, this is a very sad moment. And we will win this, and as far as I'm concerned, we already have won it.
Professor Thurman, there's so much to look at there, because, I mean, you've got this, you know, it's a very sad moment. Look at his hands. Look at what he's doing, the way he moves his hands. There's a whole lot of communication happening in so many levels.
Absolutely. During the Obama presidency, everybody admired the beautiful cadences of Obama's speech, the way in which it had a certain kind of rhyme and rhythm to it, or meter in poetic terms. Trump has a sort of perversion of that, which is that he knows how to land a sentence, how to end it, often with this kind of hand gesture with his hands, or to give the sort of the wagging finger, almost P.W. Botha-like. So I think if we're going to talk about the language of Trump, we also have to talk not just about the linguistic violence, but also about the language of the body, and how gesture and gesticulation, sometimes imitation when Trump is mocking somebody, as we've seen in the past with disability and otherwise, and sometimes with filling the emptiness of those moments when he's seeking for a word or he's repeating himself. The gesticulation helps him. And so even though he seems in so many ways a kind of transparently mockable orator, he nonetheless remains effective for those who are looking for instances of charisma.
Let's look now at the presidential nominee for the Democratic Party, Joe Biden. He spoke this morning, saying he believes he's on track to win the election. He addressed his nation earlier in his home city of Wilmington in Delaware. Biden says he's confident of a win in Pennsylvania.